The Yakuts, living in the coldest place on Earth. Deep in the Sakha region of eastern Siberia lies Oymyakon, the coldest inhabited place on the planet, where winter readings sink into the -60s and the record has fallen to 90 degrees below zero. The cold here is no accident because Oymyakon sits in a deep valley ringed by mountains, where the heavy frozen air pools at the bottom with nowhere to escape and only deepens through the winter. For weeks the sun barely clears the hills, and the light shrinks to a few pale hours. The people here are the Sakha, also called the Yakuts, and they are not native to this frozen land. Centuries ago, their ancestors were horse herders, far to the south near Lake Baikal, but war and pressure from rivals drove them north until they reached the brutal cold of the Lena River. They carried a herding life into a place that should have killed it. Where dark forests offered little grazing, they found scattered grass meadows called alas. Each one circled a small lake, and on these green islands they kept their horses and cattle alive through the killing winters. Their horses became something no other horse could be. The Yakutian horse lives outdoors all year, even at 90 below. It grows a dense double coat and a thick layer of fat, then survives the winter by digging through 5 feet of snow with its hooves to reach the dead grass below. The Sakha cattle were just as tough, short and rounded to hold in their heat, each marked with a pale stripe down the spine. They endure cold that would kill ordinary breeds, and the people guarded them so fiercely they became the first animal on Earth protected by its own conservation law. Growing food here is nearly impossible, so the Sakha learned to live on what the cold could keep. Their most famous dish is stroganina. They take fresh river fish frozen solid the moment it leaves the water, hold it upright on a board, and shave off long thin curls to eat raw and icy. The rest of the table came straight from their animals. They sliced frozen raw foal meat into thin sheets, drank fermented mare's milk called kumis, and made use of the blood and the organs too, because in this cold nothing from a butchered animal could ever be allowed to go to waste. Summer is short and violent here, just a few warm weeks before the freeze returns. In that brief window, the Sakha gather wild berries by the basket and freeze them for the dark months, whipping them later into a frozen cream called kyorchek that gives a little sweetness against the white. To survive the nights, the Sakha built the balagan, a low house of slanted log walls packed thick with earth and dung against the frost. A fire burned at its heart, and the family's cattle were often kept in a stall built right against the wall, so the animals' warmth helped heat the home. Beneath every village lies permafrost, ground frozen solid hundreds of feet down that never thaws. It makes farming impossible and even burying the dead a struggle, since the earth is hard as stone, and today builders raise their houses on tall stilts so the heat indoors cannot melt the ice below. Daily life is a constant fight against the freeze. Step outside and your breath crackles, your eyelashes turn to white needles within minutes, and engines are left running for hours because a cold motor may never start again. The village school stays open until it drops past 60 below. Not far away stands Yakutsk, the coldest city in the world. Founded as a frontier fort about 400 years ago, and now home to high towers built on frozen ground. The winters hold near 40 below, yet summer can swing all the way to 100, the widest temperature range on Earth. For around 700 years the Sakha have held this ground, the only people on Earth to make a lasting home in such cold. They did not beat the winter so much as learn to live inside it, and to them the killing freeze is not an enemy at all, but simply the world they know. Hey, if you've made it this far, you're my kind of person. Hit subscribe and I'll keep the stories coming. The Nenets, herding reindeer across the frozen tundra. The Nenets people live on the Yamal Peninsula of Arctic Siberia, a name that means the edge of the world. Each year they drive vast herds of reindeer nearly 800 miles, through cold that falls past 50 below. Their whole life follows the reindeer between two worlds. In winter the herds graze on moss and lichen in the sheltered forests of the south, and when the long Arctic summer comes, the Nenets push them far north to the open tundra near the cold Kara Sea, then turn around and do it again. The migration moves about 15 miles a day, and everything the family owns moves with it. The women break down the camp and load the long wooden sledges, the herders guide the animals across the snow, and the entire household rolls forward as one slow caravan beneath the gray Arctic sky. Each night they raise the chum, a tall cone of long larch poles wrapped in heavy reindeer hides against the wind. A fire burns at the center for warmth and cooking, and the space inside is divided by old custom, with one side kept for the family and the other for sacred and guest use. The hardest day of all is the river crossing. Twice a year the herds must cross nearly 30 miles of the frozen Ob, a wide arm of the Arctic Sea. With no grazing anywhere on the ice, the whole herd has to make the entire crossing in one single, unbroken push. In the depth of winter, that crossing turns deadly. The animals weaken fast with no food on the ice. The cold bites hard enough to freeze bare skin in moments, and the herders push on for a full day and night without stopping, racing to reach the far shore before the reindeer give out. The reindeer give the Nenets everything they need to live. The same animals carry them, feed them, and clothe them. Their hides are turned into hooded fur coats called militsa, worn fur side in, with fur boots and mittens that hold off a cold no store-bought coat could survive. Their daily food comes from the herd as well. Reindeer meat is eaten frozen, raw, or boiled, and after a fresh kill, the family drinks the warm blood straight away, because in a land with no fruit or vegetables, that blood carries the vitamins that keep scurvy and sickness away. Pulling the sledges takes trained animals chosen from the herd. Each morning, the herders wade into the milling reindeer, swinging long rope lassos, picking out the strongest by eye, roping them one at a time and harnessing them to the sledges before the day's long march can begin. Life out on the open tundra is never truly safe. Wolves shadow the herd and pick off stragglers in the dark, sudden blizzards can hide the world in a white blur within minutes, and a thin patch on a frozen river can swallow a sledge, so the herders watch the snow without rest. This life is far older than any country here. The Nenets came long ago from the forests of southern Siberia, and they have herded across this frozen ground for more than 1,000 years. The routes and the skills passed down through the generations, almost unchanged to this day. The frozen ground here hides a far deeper past. In 2007, a Nenets herder named Yuri Kuti found a baby mammoth washed out of the permafrost beside a river. It was perfectly preserved after 42,000 years, but he refused to touch it because his people believe the mammoth roams the underworld. The modern world now presses in hard on the herders. Giant gas fields and steel pipelines cut across the old migration routes, and a warming climate brings rain that freezes into hard ice over the lichen, locking away the food and forcing some families to give up the only life they know. Still, the herds move north each spring, as they always have. The Nenets remain among the last true reindeer nomads on Earth. They still cross the same frozen tundra their ancestors did, behind the same hardy reindeer, in cold as deep as it was 1,000 winters ago. The Norse of Greenland, the colony that vanished. Around the year 985, a Viking named Eric the Red led a fleet west from Iceland and founded the first European settlement on Greenland, a colony that would cling to the edge of the Arctic ice for almost 500 years before vanishing. Eric did not come to Greenland by his own choice. He had been thrown out of Iceland for killing men in a feud, just as his father had been exiled from Norway before him. With nowhere left to go, he sailed into the unknown west and spent 3 years exploring the empty, frozen coast. When his exile ended, Eric sailed back to Iceland to sell his discovery. He called the new land Greenland, a warm and tempting name chosen on purpose to lure settlers across the ocean. The pitch worked, drawing hundreds of farmers eager for free land in a place that sounded green and rich. The voyage itself proved how cruel the sea could be. 25 ships set out from Iceland, loaded with people and livestock, but only 14 ever reached Greenland. The rest turned back or were lost beneath the waves, and the 400 who survived founded a whole new world. The newcomers built their homes along the few green fjords in the far south. They split into 2 main colonies, the larger eastern settlement and the smaller western settlement. At his own grand farm of Brattahlid, high above the water, Eric the Red lived out his days as their chieftain. For a while, the colony truly thrived in the cold. The Norse raised cattle, sheep, and goats on the thin grass and built long houses of turf and stone, with walls thick enough to hold the heat. They kept the church, the tools, and the customs of distant Europe alive at the edge of the ice. The land alone could never feed them, so they turned to the sea. They hunted seals along the coast and caribou in the hills, and over the years the sea gave more than the farms ever could, until seals made up the greater part of their diet and the ocean became their true larder. But the real treasure lay much further to the north. Each summer the men sailed for weeks into dangerous icy waters to hunt walrus for their tusks, then carried that ivory all the way back to Europe, trading it for the iron, the timber, and the goods the bare island could never provide. Then slowly the climate itself began to turn against them. From around 1250 the world cooled into what we now call the Little Ice Age. The summers grew shorter and colder, the hay crop shrank, and drifting sea ice began to choke the very fjords the ships needed to reach open water. The smaller colony was the first to fall silent. Around 1350, a church official sailed north to the western settlement and found something chilling. Empty farms with cattle and sheep wandering loose, and not a single soul anywhere. Neither Christian nor heathen, he wrote, and then sailed home. Far away, the colony's lifelines were snapping one by one. The market for walrus ivory collapsed as cheaper elephant tusk reached Europe. The one official supply ship sank in 1369, and after the old bishop died, no new one was ever sent, leaving Greenland slowly forgotten by the world beyond. The last clear word from Greenland is strangely ordinary. In 1408, a ship of visiting Icelanders watched 2 of their own marry inside Valsey Church, a stone building that still stands today, and they reported that everything seemed perfectly normal. After that wedding, the records simply stop. Then within a few generations, the whole society simply disappeared. By about 1450, the farms lay abandoned and the Norse were gone, and when a missionary named Hans Egede sailed in to find them in 1721, he discovered only crumbling stone ruins and Inuit families, with no trace of the settlers. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to them. Cold, hunger, and collapsing trade all closed in together, and somewhere in the silence after 1408, an entire people slipped quietly out of history, leaving only their churches and their farms standing empty against the ice. The Mongols, conquering in the dead of winter. On the open steppe of Central Asia, where winter nights plunge to 40 below and whole herds can freeze in a single storm, Genghis Khan forged a nation of horsemen who would turn that brutal cold into the deadliest weapon of the age. The steppe is a land that breaks the weak. Its winters run for half the year and drop past 40 below. The very worst of them is a disaster the Mongols call the dzud, when deep snow and ice can kill thousands of animals in days, leaving only the toughest alive. The man who would unite them grew up in that hardship himself. As a boy, his father was poisoned by enemies, and his family was then cast out by their own clan to survive the steppe alone. They scraped by on roots and small game, and the cruelty of those years hardened him into iron. By 1206, he had bent every rival tribe to his will and taken the name Genghis Khan. From the scattered clans, he built a single, disciplined army of mounted archers, organized into neat units of tens, hundreds, and thousands. With it, he began to carve out the largest land empire in history. In the end, everything rested on the small Mongol horse. Barely the size of a pony, but thick and strong, it lived outdoors all winter, foraging for grass beneath the snow and enduring cold that would kill a finer animal. That gave its rider a mount no stable horse could ever match. What truly set them apart was how many horses each man rode. A single warrior kept 3 to 5 mounts, and sometimes far more. By switching to a fresh horse the moment one tired, a column could cover 60 miles in a day and strike long before any enemy knew it was coming. They could also ride without a supply train slowing them down. Each man carried borts, strips of meat dried stiff in the wind, plus dried curds and a skin of fermented mare's milk. Light enough for a saddlebag, the food lasted for months and kept a man going without any fire. In the worst stretches, they fed on the horses themselves without killing them. A rider would open a small vein in his mount's neck, catch the warm blood in a cup and mix it with milk to drink, then close the cut, letting men ride for days across empty country on almost nothing else. They dressed for the cold as carefully as they fought. Over a soft undershirt, each man wore a heavy fur-lined robe called a deal. Padded trousers, thick felt boots, and a fur cap completed it, all of it loose enough to ride in and warm enough to sleep in on the snow at 40 below. Most armies dreaded winter, but the Mongols welcomed it. While their enemies waited for the spring thaw before daring to fight, the Mongols moved when the cold was at its worst, because frozen rivers and hard snow-packed ground let their horses travel where soft mud would have trapped an army. That winter advantage reached its deadly peak in Russia. The army Genghis had built, led a decade after his death by his general Subutai and his grandson Batu, swept toward the Russian lands in the winter of 1237, using the frozen rivers as broad open highways straight into enemy country. The Russians never expected war in the deep snow. Their princes fought in the warmer months and were caught completely off guard as the Mongols rode the ice through the forests. And in December 1237, the first great city, Ryazan, was stormed and burned after only days of siege. From there, the bitter cold only carried them deeper. They burned Kolomna and Moscow, took the capital at Vladimir in February 1238, and 3 winters later stormed the great city of Kiev itself, riding through ice that crippled every enemy but seemed only to make the Mongols stronger. The Mongols had done the impossible, conquering a continent on horseback through the very season that killed other armies. Only the sudden death of their great Khan far away finally turned them back, and to the end the cold was never their enemy, but the loyal ally that carried them to war. If you enjoyed this video, hit the subscribe button for more. Drop your thoughts in the comments below and see you in the next one.